It is an honour to speak at this event celebrating the 30th anniversary of the China miracle. Saying this is not to be polite, it is because so much is to be learnt from this book and the new structural economics of which it is a foundation stone. I would like to speak here not only on the book's Chinese but its international significance, although of course its subject is the study of China's economy. This is because the China miracle is extremely important not only for China but for international economic theory and development. What is striking from this international angle is the book's combination of great originality simultaneously with a continuity with classical economics. It is the relation of these I would like to particularly concentrate on. As is well known, the China miracles analysis unfolds from a truly innovative analysis of comparative advantage. The textbook examples of comparative advantage typically relate to physical factors, the presence or absence of raw materials, climate. A country with a colder climate specialises in wheat, countries with warmer climates in wine, etc. The great originality of the China miracle is that it instead analyses comparative advantage from a different angle, that of factors of production, i.e. labour, capital, raw material resources. It is this which explains not only its innovative character, but its continuity with the most classical economic ideas. I would like to explore the background to this. The founding work of modern economics, Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, is of course greatly honoured, but it is very little read. Ask students or members of an economics faculty and you will find out how few have fully read it. It is frequently reduced to the famous sentence on the invisible hand. This is a great error. Smith's great work is systematic. The entire work flows from its first sentence. The greatest improvement in the productive powers of labour seem to have been the effects of division of labour. We may note that in his early work, Marx took Smith's use of the term division of labour, and in his later work used the terminology of socialisation of labour, but there was no change in the content. Smith founded economics not by discovering division of labour, that was already known, but by being the first to systematically analyse its implications. What is remarkable is how closely, 250 years later, modern econometric studies confirm Smith's analysis, identifying it as a work of genius. Below I will focus on two aspects which particularly directly relate to the China miracle, but first it is worth summarising some other aspects of Smith's analysis which are better known. The first is the importance of international division of labour, today termed globalisation. In 1970, trade was 26% of world GDP. Today it is 63%. The majority of world GDP is now internationally traded. China's opening up is based on this process. This increase in international division of labour globalisation shows the decisive question of understanding and utilising comparative advantage in a global perspective, as the China miracle repeatedly emphasises. Second is increase in national division of labour. This is reflected in the statistical finding that intermediate products, the inputs of one industry into another, are the most rapidly growing economic sector. As Xi Jinping put it regarding China, all regions should identify their own positions and comparative advantages. We cannot engage in small but complete. This directly relates to the key issue of change in overall national factor endowment over time emphasised in the China miracle. The role of infrastructure investment, for example, is not just in meeting physical needs, but is the necessary condition for developing domestic division of labour. Third is systematic application of science to production, the importance of research and development, which is the key to innovation. New structural economics notes that China, as a developing country, has been able to utilise latecomer advantage, although US sanctions now try to limit this. China has achieved far higher levels of R&D expenditure in GDP than other developing countries, and this is key to the development of its new productive forces. China's 2.4% of GDP expenditure on R&D is far ahead of the next global south countries of Turkey's 1.4%, Brazil's 1.2%, Russia's 1.0% and India's 0.6.7%. But China's level of R&D has still not achieved the level of 4 of the G7 economies. Both US policy and China's development bringing it closer to the technological frontier means that further enlargement of R&D is a decisive long-term task for China. Fourth, the importance of applying education and skilling to the labour force, improvements in labour quality through specialised education. China has made immense step forward in this, but it will continue to take decades to complete. Only 15% of China's population aged 15 to 64 has tertiary education, compared to 20% in the US and 70% in South Korea. It should be noted that Marx founded Marxism by understanding and developing the implications of Smith's analysis of division of labour even more thoroughly, demonstrating the whole development of human history as being from small groups to the creation of the modern globalised economy with all the consequences that flow from this process. There are numerous other dimensions that could be analysed, but two will be concentrated on here as they particularly relate to the China miracle. The first key consequence is that any developing country, except for very smallest mono-industrial ones, cannot successfully develop by concentrating on individual projects which are taken out of the context of its economy as a whole. That was an attempted strategy, as the China miracle notes, to upgrade their industrial and technological structures. Those countries or regions mobilised their limited resources to support the development of one or two capital-intensive industries. But upgrading a small number of industrial and technological structures in isolation from its overall economic structure is unsuccessful. As the China miracle puts it, the problem is that the upgrade of industrial and technological structures is an endogenous variable in the economic development process. A classic example, in addition to those analysed in the China miracle, particularly in Asia, or earlier examples of import substitution strategies, is the energy-rich countries which benefited from the huge 1973 oil price increase. Their favourable situation essentially removed all financial constraints for developing individual projects. A further advantage was that industries could be chosen for which their natural resources were abundant. For example, advanced factories for petrochemical industries relying on oil raw materials could be purchased from abroad. But without all the accompanying economic sectors and requirements, power supply, transportation, logistics, skilled labour, etc., these individual economic projects did not achieve the level of productivity and international competitivity of advanced economies. Expressing this in terms of division, socialisation of labour, because the economy was a complex integrated structure, it was impossible to successfully develop only a few sectors in a way that was inconsistent with their overall economic structure. Expressed in terms of factor endowment, development of industrial sectors outside of overall economy-wide factor endowments was unsuccessful. That is, development must relate not only to individual sectors, but to change in the economy's overall factor endowment, as analysed in the China miracle and new structural economics. This then relates to the specific issue of factor endowment. As the China miracle puts it, the decisive factor which can be practically affected is capital. As it puts it, natural resource endowment is usually fixed, and the increase in the labour endowment is determined by population growth with small differences, usually 1 to 3%, from country to country. The only factor endowment that can be very greatly is capital. Some countries on the average enjoy an annual growth rate of 20 to 30% capital accumulation, while others see an average of 10% or even less. If these differences remain for a long period, say for a century, the impact will be enormous. Hence, when we speak of upgrading the factor endowment structure, we are referring to the increase of relative capital abundance. The process of economic development is therefore transition to capital-intensive production. It is this analysis again that new structural economics shows not only its originality, but simultaneously its continuity with classical economic theory. Adam Smith was of course writing when the Industrial Revolution was beginning, and therefore the level of investment in the economy was still very low compared to present levels. But Smith could theoretically analyse that increasing division of labour necessarily meant that indirect inputs into the productive process grew relative to direct labour. Therefore, this included that fixed investment, the product of previous production cycles used in the present production cycle, would necessarily increase as a proportion of GDP. Ricardo arrived at the same conclusion. Marx confirmed this trend and made it a cornerstone of his analysis. Keynes arrived at the same conclusion. Once again, modern econometric studies confirm this analysis. The estimates are that at the time of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the percentage of fixed investment in Britain's GDP was 5 to 7%. This compares to almost 20% in the US in its rapid economic growth after the Civil War, and around 30% in Japan in its rapid post-World War II expansion, and 35% in the development of the Asian tigers. The level of more than 40% of fixed investment in China's GDP today is therefore just the continuation of a fundamental economic trend that has been taking place for centuries. It may be added that increasing the capital factor endowment of the entire economy takes great financial resources and a considerable time period. A fruitful period for initially using scarce resources may therefore be upgrading the factor endowment of specific regions of a national economy through special economic zones, as the China Miracle notes. The China Miracle therefore was highly innovative in stating this analysis in terms of comparative advantage and drawing out the consequences of this. But its conclusion of the rising capital intensity of production is entirely in continuity with classical economic analysis. I would like to conclude by looking at the importance of the China Miracle from the viewpoint not only of general economic theory, but of socialist economic development. Why did the specific difficulties that arose in the early period of China's economy, analysed by the China Miracle, develop, and what was the consequence of solving them? As is well known, New China's early development was heavily influenced by the USSR. The latter's economy, from the introduction of the first five-year plan in 1929, was directly developed against its factor endowment. An extremely capital-intensive path of development was embarked on in an economy which, due to its GDP level at that time, was short of capital. The China Miracle sections on the leap forward strategy in the formation of the traditional economic system could equally be read as a description of the post-1929 Soviet economy. Particularly after World War II, a number of developing countries undertook heavy industry-centred programs, although the controls implemented these never reached the level of USSR. But the 1930s Soviet economic system was developed under not an economic but a geopolitical imperative. The USSR's conclusion that a military attack on it was inevitable, assumed when the first five-year plan was launched in 1929, and which took a concrete form when Hitler became German Chancellor in 1933, meant that the overwhelming problem facing the USSR in the 1930s was this military threat, which was duly carried out by Nazi Germany in 1941. The USSR's state policy imperative in this period was therefore military defence, which required the development of the capital-intensive heavy industries most directly related to military production. In the geopolitical conditions of the 1930s, this was a necessary choice. The Soviet economy in the 1930s was essentially a war economy, one that successfully fulfilled its task in the military defeat of the Nazi invasion. The USSR's error was continuation of the structure of this war economy after military victory, and in particular after the development of its nuclear weapons greatly reduced the chances of military attack on the Soviet Union. The latter development led to the unfolding of decades-long international economic competition. Maintaining a Soviet economy developing against its comparative advantage in that situation constituted an unsustainable economic disadvantage. By the 1970s, Soviet economic growth was slower than the US. What was required in the USSR, by at least the late 1960s, early 1970s, was a turn towards the pattern of China's reforming and opening up, and therefore the development of a strategy in line with its factor endowment as analysed in the China Miracle, and which led to rapid economic development in socialist China and Vietnam. To return to the start, it is because of this simultaneous combination of radical innovation, continuity with classical economic theory, and addressing the most fundamental issues of socialist economies that it is such a privilege to speak at this event on the anniversary of the China Miracle. Thank you very much indeed.